Welcome to our lesson on Deuteronomy, chapters 24 and 25. And this evening, when we look at this passage, I would like to bring to your attention that many people make the accusation against the Bible that it creates a burden and hardship on women. But I think that we'll find this evening is that Moses has laid out a portion of the law here that is particularly sympathetic to the cause of women, and he makes protections for them. And so these are the categories that we see these verses fall into: protections for women, protections against injustice, protections against economic exploitation, and then we're going to have a few words about God's judgment. Now we start with the first category, protections for women. And this first passage is a story about two men and a woman. So man A marries a woman and then he divorces her. And then man B marries the same woman and then later he divorces her. And what this passage tells us is that it would not be good for the woman to go back and marry man A. That this is something that is detestable to God. And the way that this is going to be prevented is to issue a written document, that there would be a document that would be held by somebody that would record that this woman was at one time married to man A and married to man B, and consequently when it came time to marry man A again, somebody would step in, some legislative authority would step in and say, no, we can't do this. This would be an abomination to the Lord. What are we talking about here? We're really talking about wife swapping. Some people might say, well, why shouldn't she be at liberty to marry anybody she wants? But understand, that's not really the motivation behind this, I don't think. I think that the issue is, what if these two men had conspired to do this? That they had bounced her back and forth, not once, maybe twice or three times. Maybe this would go on for the rest of her life. And the law is stepping in and saying, no, this would not be good, this would not be right. Now, Jesus is presented with this same passage by the leaders of the Jewish community during his life, and they come to him and they deliberately misunderstand the passage. And they say to Jesus, why did Moses command us to divorce our wives? Now that, you and I can probably see that. That's a deliberate misunderstanding of the passage. And Jesus says, no, that's not what he was getting at all. He said that because of the hardness of your heart, he allowed you to divorce your wives. And if you did so, there was going to be a procedure to do it. But he didn't command you to divorce your wives. And instead, Jesus appeals back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And he says, look, God created marriage. And he intended that marriage to be lifelong. And so that's how Jesus responded to this accusation from Jewish leaders. But the point is that this was really designed to be a protection for women and protect them against wife swapping. And then we get this very interesting and I think a very nice passage. He says, if there's a man who is newly married, don't send him off to war. Give him a year to be with his wife. And here's what it inserts. He says, that he might bring her happiness. What a terrific passage in the law. It is sympathetic to this woman. She is newly married. She is delighted to be married. And then all of a sudden they take her husband and send him to war, maybe never to return. She may end up a widow. And so this passage says, no. We're not going to let that happen. Give them a year together. A year to make her happy. And potentially, I think, she might end up getting pregnant and have a child. And so he might have a chance to actually experience having a family during that time. This would be good for her. This would be good for him. It's good for the community. I think it's a wonderful protection for newlywed mothers. And then we get to a passage on poverty, and actually it's scattered throughout this whole chapter here. He talks about various things that should be done for those who are in physical need, right? They're impoverished. And he includes the widow. in there. He includes women who were married who lost their husband. And often alongside that, he includes the fatherless. So these would be her children. And he has said, these are the people that you ought to be careful about and show some concern and compassion for. Now, understand that what was true then is actually true today and has been true for a long time, that the number one indicator of poverty in America, and this has been true for many, many years, is unwed motherhood. And now there are some people who are very wealthy who like to boast that it's somehow in vogue for them to be a single woman and have a child. But that is a very small minority of the people. Most people, if there's a woman and she has a child and she does not have a husband, chances are during her lifetime she will experience poverty. And that was true then as well. And so he says, make room for these people, care for them, and show them compassion. Particularly, this is a widow. This is a woman who had a child, not out of wedlock. This is a woman who had a child and she lost her husband. And now she does not have the resources that other people have. Care for her, and have compassion. And then finally here we have widowhood, and he talks a great deal about widowhood, but we get a fairly long passage describing what happens to a woman who gets married and they don't have any children. And then the husband dies. Now she's a widow, she doesn't have any children, and this portion of the law is very concerned about her, about his family line, the man who's deceased, his family line. What happens to his property, his wealth? Where does that go? What about the family name? What happens to all of that? Does it just simply die out? And we have what's called levirate marriage. Levirate marriage. And this is the arrangement that if man A gets married to a woman and man A dies, man A's brother is supposed to marry the woman and raise his family through her. This is now his wife, and he's going to raise a family through her. And if they have, let's say, for example, 2 children, child A, the firstborn child, would be considered the descendant of the deceased man. So the deceased man's wealth, his land and his wealth, would go, the inheritance would go to boy A. And then if they had boy B, then boy B would receive the inheritance from man B. And so he carries on the family line and gets the property and so on from family B. And in this way, the land would remain in the 2 separate families. And so these 2 boys, they have the same mother, they have the same father, but one is going to be known as the son of the deceased man. It's a levirate marriage. Well, this is actually a value to the woman, right? She escapes poverty. She does not have to live without a husband. She's left her family. Now she has lost her husband, and she is rescued from poverty. Now, it gives us this caveat at the end. What if the brother of the deceased man says, well, I don't want to marry her. I don't like her or whatever. I don't want to marry her. Well, there was a procedure for this. The woman could take the man to court, and they'd go before the judge, and they would really try to determine whether or not that's exactly what the man wanted. If he persisted in this, then there was a price to pay, and the price was disgrace. He didn't lose any financial value. He didn't lose any property. He wasn't harmed in any way, except that they took his sandal off, so he was barefooted. And that day and time, being barefooted was considered a disgrace, and they spit in his face. All right, so obviously he didn't keep that there, but the idea was everybody witnessed this. This man is going to live the rest of his life with some humiliation, right? Now, he doesn't have to marry the girl. He can go marry somebody else, but he at least has to live with this reputation. And so that was the procedure if she were to, he would decide not to marry her, which incidentally, we can probably imagine that the process of selecting a bride became a family affair, right? So all of the sons would probably look over the shoulder of the first son and say, are you sure you want to marry her? Because I'm not sure I want to marry her. And maybe this gal over here would be a better choice. And so it became a family affair. And then the same would be true of the gal. She would look at the husband and say, well, if he dies, I'm going to get one of these fellas, and is that going to be okay? And so it would become a group effort to decide who was going to marry who. And that probably lent itself to stronger marriages in many cases. Probably was a good idea. All right, well, we have all of those things. And then we have tacked on to the very end of this, 2 verses, verses 11 and 12 of chapter 24. And they are obscure, to say the least. And a lot of people have puzzled over these. I've read several commentaries, and people have had some trouble figuring out exactly what it means. But there is a, well, let's first describe what it is that they're talking about. Man A is married to a woman, and man B gets in a fight with man A, and they begin to tussle, or they're really going at it. And she's afraid that man B is going to overcome her husband and destroy him. And so she rushes into the fight. And in her effort to use whatever tools she has to win the battle, she reaches out and grabs him by his genitals, and presumably damages him irreparably, right? So then the law says, well, what's to happen to this woman? Was this right? Was this okay? And most translations say that there's a penalty to be paid, and the penalty is amputation of her hand. But a lot of people have struggled over that and said, well, this doesn't quite seem right. Remember, we talked about lex talionis. This is the idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That is, we take the thing away from the person who did damage to the other person's thing, right? So it's the same thing. It's a corresponding item in each person's possession. And we don't have the same 2 physical parts. It couldn't have the same 2 physical parts. So people have struggled and said, well, this wouldn't be in keeping with lex talionis. And what's more, what if she didn't actually irreparably damage this man? She has to pay for losing her hand for some what might be perceived as an act of indecency. And others have struggled over this and said, wait a minute, there's something maybe we're missing. And so I'm going to lay out for you one interpretation some scholars have come up with, and I can't say that it is the correct interpretation. It seems to make a lot of sense to me. I'm not a scholar of Hebrew, and so I can't confirm that, but I'm going to put it out to you. The word that is translated hand, her hand has to be amputated, is actually the word K-A-P-H. I don't know how to pronounce that, but apparently this word can be translated for 3 different body parts. And it actually isn't translated literally hand. It literally means palm. And that poses some difficulty. How do you amputate the palm? And that's why most translations say hand. At least that we can see how you could amputate that. The second way this word can be translated is sole of the foot. Again, how do you amputate the sole of the foot? This isn't making a lot of sense to us. Something is going wrong in the language. And so the third way to interpret this word is groin. And so we can't amputate anything there either. And then they ask the question, well, maybe we don't actually mean literal amputation. What we mean is cutting off the ability to have children. And how would that be done? Well, interestingly enough, this verse is attached right at the end of the description of levirate marriage. And that perhaps what we're saying is, since she took away this man's ability to reproduce, we're going to take away from her the opportunity to exercise levirate marriage. If she has a husband and he died, she doesn't get the chance to marry the husband's brothers. She's done. The family line is done. And that seems to make a lot of sense to me, that it doesn't, we're not amputating body parts, but instead we are metaphorically cutting off the ability to have children. Anyways, I put that out there for you to think about. The next section we move on to is protections against injustice. And the very first item that comes up is that of kidnapping. And it says if a man kidnaps his brother Israelite and he puts him into slavery, or he sells him into slavery, and they find the man who did the kidnapping, they are to execute him. This is a capital offense. Capital offense. Now, I've always looked at this law and thought that this is kind of interesting, because in American law, for a very long time, it was a capital offense to kidnap. if you were found kidnapping somebody, even if the person that you kidnapped was alive when they found you, you were to be executed. And that shouldn't surprise us, because we have grafted a lot of what's in the Mosaic law into our idea of law and justice in our country. But that particular law has always seemed very interesting to me, and it makes me ask the question, and we should ask the question, why punish it so severely? And I think the answer is that we're taking away freedom. In both cases, the kidnapping and the slavery or selling into slavery is forcibly taking somebody else's freedom. Now you'll remember earlier in the book of Deuteronomy, there was a way for a person to sell themselves into slavery, but in this case it's forcible. We have somebody who is forcing another person into slavery, and he says, if you do that, you pay for it with your life. And so that would be an injustice. Moses wants us to make sure that we understand that is not to happen. And then next, he brings up a principle, right? And he says, fathers are not supposed to pay for the sins of the sons, and the sons are not supposed to pay for the sins of the fathers. And to you and I, we might say, well, that's really obvious. Why would you even imagine that? Why is this even in here? Well, because it has not always been obvious to people. This is the way it has normally gone in times before Moses and in many times afterwards. Man A has a son and man B has a son. And man A kills man B's son. Then the law in many places would allow man B to kill man A's son. But understand that man A's son never did anything wrong. He's paying a penalty for his father's offense. And Moses says, no, we're not doing that anymore. We're not allowing that to happen. Man A kills man B's son. Man A pays for it with his own life. And man A's son remains alive. So we punish only the offender. And this was a big step for law and justice. And it is something that we as a country have held on tightly to as a high principle for us. Punish only the offender. And then there's another discussion about judges. And there's been actually many discussions in the book of Deuteronomy about judges, but he's going to drive this point home. He says, now look, two men, they have a dispute. And he says, I don't want you to resolve the dispute between you on your own. You're both emotionally involved in this dispute. That means that you're biased. And you already have an interest in the outcome of this dispute. He says, instead, you take your dispute before the judges. Why? Well, the judges should have been, presumably, unbiased. They have no interest in the outcome of this. They don't want one to win or the other to lose. Instead, they are able to look at it objectively instead of subjectively. Well, this is also a very important aspect of law and justice and order. And in fact, today, in our legal system, we have something that's called the rule of recusal, right? If there is a judge and he has two people who have a dispute who come before him, and one of them's his brother, he is supposed to say, well, I'm going to recuse myself from this case. I have an interest in the outcome of this case, and so I better let somebody else adjudicate this that is less biased. Or if two entities come before him with a dispute and he owns stock in one company, he's supposed to recuse himself from that case. He is not expected to be able to judge that fairly. And so this idea of judges being unbiased and disinterested is important. And then he reiterates, this is supposed to be by just standards, standards that apply the same to all people. It doesn't matter who they are, it's the same standard that applies. And then he tells us something about punishment. And he says, look, if man A is found to be guilty, you're to punish him. And here are 4 things to learn about the punishment. The first is that it's going to be immediate. You're going to lay the guy down on the ground and he's going to take his whipping, and that's going to be it. It's going to be immediate. Now, there's something really great about this, in that it ties the punishment to the crime. We very easily can make the connection between the two. However, if we take man A and we shuffle him off to a prison and we leave him there for 25 years, And then after 25 years, we come trot them out and we say we're going to punish you for your crime. Everybody has forgotten the crime. It doesn't matter how heinous it was. It doesn't matter what tragedies he caused. We forget the crime, and now we are sympathetic to the criminal, and may feel that he does not deserve the punishment any longer. That is not appropriate. Instead, Moses says the punishment should be immediate. We can make the connection between crime and punishment that way. And then he says the punishment should be proportionate. He says, I'm going to put a maximum limit on the number of lashes you can give this guy. In this case, they're physically beating them. But there's a limit. You can't go beyond 40 lashes, and there's a minimum that you're going to give him at least one. And I'm leaving it up to you to decide how many is an appropriate number. Why? Well, the number of lashes, the punishment, should be proportionate to the crime, right? So we don't have disproportionate punishment. We don't have a person being sent to jail for 20 years for stealing a loaf of bread. There's a famous story about that. Instead, punishment was supposed to be proportionate to the crime, and so it was to be immediate and proportionate, and it was to be without malice. The idea was not to degrade this man. The idea was not to make him feel like he was less than a brother Israelite. The idea was to say, look, you did something wrong, and there is a justice to be paid, and you'll pay this justice, and then you'll be restored as a brother Israelite. And so it was not intended to degrade the man. Good, so we had protections for women, protections against injustice. We move on to protections against economic exploitation. And throughout this chapter, he gives us these various scenarios, and he says, look, if you're harvesting, I don't want you to go over the field twice. Whatever you missed the first time, just leave it there. And the needy, the poor, they can come out and they can harvest what's left. If you've gone over the grapes once, don't go over them a second time. You might have missed a few, but leave them there. Those who are needy can come back and they can harvest some of them. And so some of these people, he says, are aliens. Why aliens? Well, these people would not be permitted to be landowners, right? They're not Jews. They didn't have an inheritance in Israel. And so they were paid workers. They were hired hands. And they probably were on the bottom of the economic scale. And so these people would have a need. And he says, well, what about the fatherless and the widow? We already talked about how they might be in poverty. And he says, these people are supposed to have some general compassion from the community that we're going to leave food around for them. Now, the landowner was not responsible to harvest the food, package it, and deliver it to the poor people. That's not his responsibility. But he was supposed to say, well, I did own the land and I did cultivate the crop, but I'm not going to reap entirely all that I harvest, all that grew. I'm going to leave some of it for others if they would like to come out and get it. And it was a great system. It was called gleaning, and we see a great example of this in the book of Ruth, and Ruth does this. It's a terrific example of it there. So they were being generous to the needy. I'm skipping down here, being generous to the needy, and this was one of the ways that they did that. They were generous in that way. The other one is, I've got here, allow a person to continue working. What is this all about? Well, so we've got man A is poor, and he still has enough substance about him to work, but he just doesn't have enough money, and he needs to borrow money. So he goes to man B, and he borrows money from man B. And it says, man B, whenever you give a loan, obviously you're going to want to get a pledge. He says that, remember, prior chapters, he was not permitted to charge him interest. You can't charge him interest. So he's not doing this in order to make a buck. He's doing this to help the man. He's lending him money to help the man. And today, we would call that pledge collateral, right? We have the same concept. If you're going to borrow some money, you have to put up some collateral. And he's trying to dispel this myth that if you lend money, you're automatically the owner of the collateral. That's not true. The collateral isn't yours until the borrower is unable to pay back the loan. And so he gives several comments about the pledge. He says, look, you can't go barging into his house and collect the pledge. Like he pledged that he was going to give you some prized possession of his. And so you say, okay, I'll give you the loan. And now you treat the man with a great deal of disrespect. You go in and you get his stuff. He says, you can't do that. And he says, you can't expect the man to pay back the loan if you take back his tools of earning the money. And so he brings up the example of a millstone, right? A millstone is you grind the grain until you get the flour, and then you could sell the flour. And he says, if you take one of the millstones away, the man is unable to pay the money back. And of course, he's going to default on the loan. Then you're going to own the millstone, and he's going to be unable to pay you back. And he says, don't do that. Allow the man to continue working. And he says that suppose the pledge he puts up is his cloak. Well, back then, a cloak might have been the only thing he had to wrap around himself at night to keep himself warm. And he says, okay, so you can accept the cloak, but when sundown comes, make sure you return the cloak. You can go get it back in the morning, but he needs his clothes to stay warm. Have some mercy on this man. He's poor. He's so poor he had to borrow from you to begin with. Give him back his cloak. Have compassion. And he said, and so we have here, respect people regardless of their financial status. Just because you are the lender doesn't mean that you are superior. And that is a word of wisdom for all of us. We must never think of ourselves as somehow superior because we have greater possessions. Of course, there's always somebody who has more possessions, right? It's a silly and simple way of looking at your life, and it's wrong. No, we don't gauge who is better or more important based on their economic status. God says you are all made in the image of God, and all of you are deeply loved. And that's the way we are to see everybody. And then finally he says, I don't want different weights and measures. And you may or may not know what this means, so we're going to go over it again. If you had a scale, you might remember a scale, you got a plate here and a plate here and a bar in between, and you put a pile of, let's say, flour, and the flour would go down to the bottom, and this side would come up to the top, and you want to know how much this weighs, and so you would take pieces of metal that you knew how much they weighed, and you'd start stacking them up. And as you stack them up on this side, when this side got level with that side, you could count up how much weight was on here, and you know that's how much this weighed. And so if I were charging $1 a pound for the flour, and there were 5 pounds over here, then I would know there were 5 pounds of flour here, and I could charge $5 for that. But what happens if I took one of these weights, and I'm going to do one of two things. Either I shave the bottom off, so I make the weight smaller, but it still says a pound on it. It doesn't actually weigh a pound. Then if I stack them up on this side, it's going to take more weights to make the weight of this flour over here. In fact, it might read, if I count them all up, it might be 7 pounds. But there's really only 5 pounds of flour here. But it looks like there's 7 pounds. I mean, each one of these weights says 1 pound on it. And so I get to charge $7 for 5 pounds of flour. Well, what is that? That's fraud. When I promise to give one thing and I give something else, that's fraud, right? I have deceived the buyer. And he says, don't do that. God does not like that. That is so dishonest. There is another way to do this fraud, by the way, and that is that if I left it at a pound, say this piece of metal weighed a pound, but instead I changed the mark on it. Instead of saying 1 pound, I said 2 pounds on it. Now, when I put 5 of these up here to balance out the 5 pounds of flour, I count them up, and now it looks like I put 10 pounds of here, and I'm going to charge them $10 for this flour. And that's fraud. That's cheating. Same can be done with measures. Like if I got a container and I make the container slightly smaller, but I say that it's a quart, but it's not really a quart, and I charge you for a quart, then that's fraud. I've promised you something that I didn't deliver. And he says, so I don't want that. We're not going to have different weights and measures. That's fraud. Don't do it. Good. And we move on to our final category, and that's God's judgment. And there are only 2 points in here. And the first one has to do with illnesses. And this is an interesting topic here. He says, if somebody has leprosy, what I want you to do is exactly what I prescribed in the rest of the law. So that means Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. We'd have to go back and find those. But what they say is if you discover that you've got a skin problem, you're to run to the priest with a sacrifice. And then you're supposed to spend some time outside of the camp. Those are two important things. Time outside of the camp and a priest. And sacrifice. And what do we learn from time outside of the camp? Well, one, it's very interesting that we should talk about this now during a quarantine, a pandemic. It quarantines you from everybody else. You stop the spread of the illness until you can determine whether or not it's contagious and if you're going to live or die, right? So that had the effect of protecting the rest of the community. That's a good thing. That's showing compassion and love for everybody else. It's not a bad thing. But the more important point I think he gets at here is when he describes this, says, do what I said in the rest of the law, and he says, and because I want you to remember what God did to Miriam on the way out of Egypt. What God did to Miriam on the way out of Egypt. And we have to remember, what was that story about? Well, that story was when they came out of Egypt, they got into the desert, they're there for a little while. Aaron and Miriam started complaining to Moses. They said, Moses, you're just our little brother. I mean, we can hear God just as well as you. Why can't we be the leaders? And so Moses says, God says, well, why don't the three of you come over here? And he has a conversation with them. And at the end of the conversation, Miriam is covered with leprosy. She's white as snow, it says. And Aaron's crushed. He says, Moses, don't let this happen to her. Please intervene. And so Moses turns to the Lord. He says, Lord, please forgive my sister. Please heal her. And God says, she'll be healed, but not yet. And he says, I'm doing this as a judgment. She has offended me, and I'm judging her for it. Why is that brought to our attention when we're talking about leprosy in the book of Deuteronomy? And I think the answer is in the whole concept that when somebody was discovered to have this leprosy, they were supposed to go offer a sacrifice. If we turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we're told something similar. The Apostle Paul says to the people in Corinth, he says, now, reflecting on what happened in the desert, these things were written down for your benefit, that you might learn from them. And he recounts various instances, and it's interesting, each story is a story of God's judgment. He says the people got involved in sexual immorality, and many of them, God killed them. And people got involved in grumbling, and God brought judgment against them, and they died. And people got involved in idolatry, and God judged them, and they died. Right? So he goes through these stories, and each one of them is an act of disobedience and corresponding judgment, which resulted in sickness and death. And one chapter later in 1 Corinthians, chapter 11, we get to a description about what happens at the Lord's Supper. And he says, now listen, when you come together for the Lord's Supper, I want to make sure you examine yourself very carefully. This is very serious. And he says, because some of you have failed to do this, some of you are sick, and in fact, some of you have died. What are we saying? We're saying that some sicknesses come as a result of disobedience. Now, it would be absolutely wrong to make the argument that all sickness is the result of disobedience and judgment. I don't think we can say that. But it would be appropriate if we experience illness and difficulty in our lives to first look at what's happening spiritually. Have I brought this on myself by my own sin and disobedience? And the answer may be yes, in which case there should be appropriate confession and repentance. In the book of James, he says, confess your sins to one another that you might be healed. Right? That's the appropriate response to sin. Confession and repentance. Now, you may discover, no, that is not the cause of my sickness. And that may very well be, but it's still appropriate for us to ask the question. And I think that's why he brings this up here. That's what they were supposed to do, because they were to remember that some sickness comes as a result of God's judgment. And the final act of God's judgment in this chapter, he says, remember Amalek. Now, when the nation of Israel was traveling through the desert, the nation of Amalek was cruel to them. And they killed some of them. They brought a great harm to them. And God says, now look, when you get into the land of Canaan, I gave you a list of nations that we're supposed to, I'm going to bring judgment against, and you're supposed to wipe out, I want you to add one more. Add Amalek to them. I want you, when you're settled, you get everything all buttoned up over there, now you come back out, and I want you to bring war against Amalek. I want you to wipe him out. God's judgment can be severe, can be very severe. And we ought to always remember that. That's an important point. Good, so we have protections for women, protections against injustice, protections against economic exploitation, and some comments about God's judgment. Thank you.